Thank you, Mike. In 10 days, our oldest grandchild will be 10 years old. I can't really wrap my mind around that. 10 years. I was thinking about the passage of time, and I remembered that 1972 song Jim Croce had, "Time in a Bottle," a song that became even more popular a year later upon his death. And a few years later, when I was in high school, it was still a popular song, but I had no idea really what he meant when he yearned to save time in a bottle. And when he talked about how there never seems to be enough time to do the things you want to do once you find them. For me, I had no desire to save time in a bottle. I had all the time in the world. And there was plenty of time to decide what I want to do, and plenty of time to do the things that I want to do. But now that I'm 60 years old, it's a bit different. Sometimes, if I'm honest, I do want to sort of save time in a bottle, or I want to call time out and have the clock stop for a little bit. Because time really is flying by. I think of the words of the psalmist in the 90th Psalm, when the psalmist says in the way of a prayer, teach us to count our days, to number our days, that we may get a heart of wisdom, that we can have a wise heart. Teach us to count our days. When we think about a healthy spirituality for our time, and that's what we're thinking about in this series, understanding the sacredness of the present is a part of that healthy spirituality. Embracing the moment, living in the only place that we can live, which is in the present moment, and understanding it to be sacred because our days are numbered. They can be counted. Most of the time, people don't know how many days they have, but they can certainly be counted. They're not infinite. And so embracing that and understanding the power of the present is a part of a healthy spirituality. Teach us to count our days that we can have a wise heart. So we're thinking about the sacredness of the present time. And we're thinking about that related to the story of Mary and Martha in the Gospel of Luke. Jesus is traveling and he comes to a certain village. Now, in the Gospel of John, that village is named, it's Bethany. There's Mary and Martha and their brother Lazarus. But here it's not named. In the Gospel of Luke, perhaps it is because Luke it doesn't want us to focus on the place. But Luke wants us to focus on what's going on in the story and its meaning for us beyond a particular place. In fact, it's a story that can be acted out in any place, any time. So Jesus is visiting these friends of his, Mary and Martha. They are sisters. And Mary does something that is radical for the first century in that era and in that place. She is sitting at Jesus' feet as a disciple, as a student of a rabbi. She's a woman. Luke is always careful in his gospel over and over again to make sure that we understand that everybody can be a disciple of Jesus. Everybody is welcome into discipleship. And so here is Mary sitting at Jesus' feet, listening intently to his teaching. And her sister Martha is doing something really important. Martha is about the sacred duty of hospitality, and she's busy. She is preoccupied with all kinds of things, the text says. And she's passing by, you can imagine, going about the work of getting the meal ready and extending hospitality to Jesus. And as she passes by over and over again, there's Mary just sitting there. Finally, Martha has enough of that, and she says to Jesus, in effect, "Sir, tell my sister to get up and help me." But Jesus doesn't do that. Instead, Jesus, you can imagine, smiles. He probably knows these sisters well. He smiles, he pats Martha on the shoulder and says, "Martha, Martha, you are distracted and worried about many things. One thing is necessary. Mary has chosen the better portion, and it will not be taken from her." One thing is necessary. One thing. The better portion. What is that one thing? It reminds me of that scene from City Slickers, that classic movie where three guys who are kind of having a midlife crisis decide to go and find themselves at this dude ranch. They decide that they need to recharge, they need to find the meaning of life, and they think living as a cowboy on the open range is a way to do that. And so they go to this dude ranch, and their guide is a man named Curly. Curly is a grizzled old cowboy. And it's Curly who is their guide on this cattle drive from the high country down into the valley, moving the herd. And they admire him, but they're afraid of him. He's a man of very few words, almost no words. And they're intimidated by him, but they see in him a kind of confidence in who he is, a strength. There's something about him that they want to understand. They want to know his secret. So there's this scene where Billy Crystal's character is riding with Curly, and they're talking. And what's kind of unusual is Curly becomes relatively talkative. Crystal asks him some questions, and he answers, and it's clear that Crystal's character is trying to get at the secret of what makes him tick and what's the secret of his life. So at a certain point, Curly stops. They stop. And Curly says, "Do you know what the meaning of life is?" And the answer is, No, I don't. And so he holds up his index finger. Crystal's character says, "Your finger? One thing. Just one thing." "What is that one thing?" he asks. "That is for you to discover. Just one thing." I wonder if Martha, as has been the case with generations that followed her, had the same sort of question. What is that one thing? What is the one thing that's necessary that Jesus talked about? What is the better portion? Seems to me that one thing is that Mary was present. She was present in that moment. She was present with Jesus. She was present in that situation, fully present, not distracted as Martha was. That word "distracted" is a translation of a Greek word that means dragged around. She was dragged around from place to place with all of her duties, and she couldn't be present in the moment and present to Jesus in that moment. And that was the one thing that was necessary. Now, through the years, when I've taught this in Bible studies, a lot of people have confessed to me that they don't like this story. Some of them are like Martha. They're really active people. They want to be busy. They understand the importance of being active. And so they don't like this story because Martha seems to be painted in a bad light when, if it weren't for Martha, nothing would get done. It's like this 19th century poem by Giuseppe Belli in which he has Martha answer Jesus when she says, "Mary has chosen the better portion." And Martha answers, so says you, I know better. She is just sitting around, as she usually does, on her salvation. And if it weren't for me, nothing would get done. And there are people who really feel that way about this story. They identify with Martha. They feel like Martha is not being treated fairly. The other group that doesn't like this story says, it feels like a no-win situation. I mean, you're either busy doing stuff, and that's not good, but if you don't do anything at all and you're just sitting around all the time, nothing gets done, I mean, surely there's a third option here, isn't there? I mean, things have to get done, but we also have to pay attention to what's going on. Charles Wesley tried in one of his hymns to capture this when in the hymn he said that he wanted the serving hands of Martha and the loving heart of Mary. That's a pretty good way to think about that. I like what Eugene Peterson does with this. He uses an image that I think is helpful here. Instead of just saying that Mary has chosen the better portion, he says that Mary has chosen the main course, kind of using the meal and the hospitality image. The main course. So Jesus isn't saying that what Martha has done is not important. In fact, this story immediately follows Jesus' parable of the Good Samaritan, which, if there's any parable in the Gospels that talks about being active, and when you see a need, you address it. You don't just pass by on the other side. If there's any story that is Martha-like, it's that story, and that's followed by the story of Martha and Mary. And so in the Gospel of Luke, Luke seems to be finding a balance there himself. But Mary is living in the present, and she's fully inhabiting the present. Reverend Lynn Loney reminded me this week of something that Susan Beaumont, our church consultant, said a couple of years ago. She coined this term. She took the word presence and she made it into a verb. And when she talked about the work of Focused First, the work that we were doing to answer the question, who's our neighbor, and who are we in relationship to God, and what is God calling us to do in this particular time, and who are we, and what are we supposed to be doing, she said we begin with presencing, with being fully present to one another, fully present to God, and fully present to our situation. And that is healthy spiritual work for our time. Fully inhabiting the present, presencing. The Gospel of Luke seems to be particularly concerned about this because Luke has this parable that Jesus tells of a man who is always looking to some future. He builds barns to hold his grain, and when those are full, he builds more barns to hold more grain, and more barns to hold more grain. And he says, and I'm paraphrasing, one of these days, I'm going to be able to relax and eat and drink and be merry, and life will be good. But then, in the parable, he dies. And then the question is, and who does all that belong to then? Certainly it's a parable about what's important, and it's a parable about what we do with what we have, but it's also this parable that is a kind of warning about not trying to live in some future time, but living fully in the present. And so our work of spirituality is to be fully present. For today is the day that we have. This moment is the moment that we have. Now I confess to you that whenever I preach, I am always preaching to myself. And I confess to you that this is something that I've struggled with for a long time. It's not so much that I look back to another time, although I confess I've been looking back some to 2 months ago, 3 months ago, what that was like. But my thing is, I'm usually looking forward to the next thing, or usually wondering what the next thing will bring. And certainly this is a season where I think a lot of us are doing that, wondering what is the new normal going to be? What's next? What comes next? And a healthy spirituality for our time is to inhabit and to fully live in the present. To be fully aware of the present and what's going on around us and the people around us, and to be fully present to God and what God has to say to us in this season. I love an interview with a centenarian on her 100th birthday when the reporter asked a question. He said, "What was it like in your time?" She looked at him with an odd expression and then a smile, and she said, "This is my time. This is my time. This is our time. This is the time in which we are living, and a healthy spirituality for our time inhabits that." I want to close with this, and that is, Susan and I live on a park in Eagle Ranch. It's out in northwest Fort Worth. And our backyard's very small, and we have a wrought iron fence. And behind that wrought iron fence is a city park that's really beautiful. It has a pond, it has a walking trail around it, it has a great playground right there. And so we like to think that we have a huge backyard that someone else takes care of. And we've been noticing something. Susan was the first to point it out. She said, "Have you noticed how many fathers there are now spending time fishing in the pond with their kids, playing on the playground with the kids, walking, families walking together?" We've lived there for 3 years, and we have seen that more now than any time before. This amazing way in which people are present to each other. There is a Facebook page that's called Gifts of the Pandemic, where people are trying to be present in such a way that they can see that there are gifts even in this time. And one of those gifts that we've seen over and over again is family spending time together. Now we've talked to neighbors, and we know how hard it is to homeschool. We know how hard and challenging it is to get the work done and with the kids at home, but there are gifts in it. And in this present time, there are gifts to celebrate. So it's my prayer for you and for me, in the words of the psalmist, that God would teach us to count our days, that we would have a heart of wisdom, that we would know this is the day the Lord has made, and we would rejoice in it. Amen.